Are the mics open? There they are. They're on.
We're on.
We're on. That was the opening theme. That means we say, welcome to the Link Online. And we're back again. Live on Facebook and on the RCI website at 17:15 hours GMT, or 1:15 in the afternoon here in Montreal, where it's not quite as chilly as it was the other day, because in some parts of the city it got down to 0 degrees.
Did you turn on your heat?
No, but you know what? I was driving north of the city, because I live out of town, and there was a little bit of rain, and it was almost snow. You know, you could see the way it was
too early. Too early
indeed, because not all the apples are in yet either.
No.
Anyway, that's that. This is the camera on here, so we'll wave. Yep. Hello, people. We're here live,
hello.
And with me, of course, is Lynn Desjardins waving at you. Levon Savants waving at you.
Hello, hello.
Marie-Claude Simard.
Hello.
In the control room once again, the lovely and talented Chantal Saint-Sauveur. And back with us from another failed golf trip down south in the middle of the stormy weather is Pierre Dutil, keeping an eye on things. He's laughing. The second year in a row, eh? Third year in a row. Gee whiz.
You can't go in October.
Well, it makes for an exciting trip, even if you don't get to play golf, right?
That's true.
That's right. That's what he says. Well, we've got an exciting show coming up for you. Lynn, what about you?
I'll tell you about the increased risk of developing psychosis among big consumers of cannabis.
And speaking of cannabis,
Speaking of cannabis, I'll take you downtown Montreal to talk to some of the people who were very, very excited about the end of cannabis prohibition in Canada.
And speaking of cannabis yet again, Marie-Claude.
I'll tell you about a 9-year-old girl from Edmonton who saw a great business opportunity on Wednesday on the first legal sales day of cannabis in Canada.
All right, and we'll start off in just a moment about a very serious story, that of the disappearance of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
Yeah.
And we'll find out what a Canadian expert says about the international implications that might have. That's coming up on this edition, The Link Online. Well, it's in the news, of course, around the world, and that is the disappearance of Saudi journalist and critic of the regime, Jamal Khashoggi, who, he went into the Istanbul embassy of the Saudi government on October the 2nd. Consulate. And he never emerged after that. And there's a good deal of circumstantial evidence. And authorities in Turkey say they have audio evidence of the murder of this journalist, but that, of course, remains under wraps for the moment. Nobody else apparently has heard or seen that Turkish evidence that they're claiming. Western leaders have been relatively mild in their comments on the situation. Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, expressing concern, for example. And in this excerpt of a much longer conversation, international affairs expert Canada feels that even if it is proven that a murder took place, world condemnation is still likely to remain relatively mild. Elliot Tepper is a professor at Carleton University, and he starts out explaining why international reaction has been so mild to date.
This is entirely a political and policy choice, the degree to which states wish to make this an issue beyond expressions of concern.
The Saudis, of course, have oil, and everybody needs oil. Is it like they must know that they have this economic power over most of the world?
The Saudis have acted apparently with a sense of impunity because they know their significance economically because of oil and geopolitically because of the role they play in the Middle East. That has given a sense of protection to them, which allegedly has led them to act in this brazen fashion. And in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, his columns are translated into Arabic, circulated by social media, and he was speaking about forming some kind of a new international forum to broadcast across the Arab world the kinds of information that countries and leaders such as Saudi Arabia would not welcome.
Now, in terms of reaction, once again, the Saudis have organized this big economic summit, Davos in the desert, it's being called, and several people have said they're not going to attend. Does that really have any effect?
What was happening in Davos in the desert was a mobilization of international capital to invest in the modernization process. backed by substantial Saudi funding. Now you have the Dutch and the French finance minister saying they're not going. The head of the IMF is not going. Significant leaders of the business community are not going, but another 130 are. So we are in this interesting period where it's not clear how this is going to play out, and therefore there's uncertainty. If this does blow over, which I think is the Saudi intention, just drag it out a little, cover it up to the best possible, and then go back to business as usual, then the next Davos in the desert probably would be business as usual. If this leads to instability inside Saudi Arabia over the leadership of the Crown Prince, remember the line of succession was actually changed to bring him into power. He then upset all of the delicate balance which had been normal in the politics. He's broken or shaken up the relations with the Wahhabi religious establishment, and that partnership between the monarchy and the religious establishment is the foundation of the Ibn Saud state. So he's made a lot of domestic enemies, and now we'll have to see if he can survive the crisis, which apparently he has himself initiated. There is a chance, Mark, that Saudi Arabia will have internal instability. So if there's internal instability, then the politics of the region changes. If Saudi Arabia gets weaker, Iran de facto gets stronger in the competition for regional dominance.
And Professor Tepper also points out that the West, especially the U.S., counts on the Saudi regime for that degree of stability in the region and as a counter to Iran's ambitions. And he also notes that Khashoggi had ties to Turkey's leader and wonders what Turkey's motivation is for saying they have evidence from inside the Saudi embassy, which points to a bit of an espionage kind of issue. And on top of that, why, if they have it, they haven't released it so far, or that we know of anyway. And he suggests also that the Saudis and possibly others now are trying to find a way out of this to avoid a major international political shakeup. And what this might mean internationally for the Crown Prince himself, whose actions inside, as Mr. Tepper pointed out, have created certain enemies. And if he gets in trouble and the Saudi regime falls and is replaced, and who knows what's going on. It's all very, very interesting. And as I mentioned, that's part of a longer conversation I had with Professor Elliot Tepper. And if you'd like to hear that, just go to the highlights section of our website, and the full interview there. It's about, I think, 12 minutes long, but it's all very, very interesting if you're interested in this case at all. Something very fishy has been going on, isn't it? I mean, that's
it's one of those cases where it has the potential of really shaking up at least internal Saudi politics, because, as the professor mentioned, he has made so many very powerful enemies within Saudi Arabia, and it's very likely that if this they'll just pounce at this opportunity to.
Yeah, he certainly didn't make friends by locking everybody, by all those rich people up in a hotel for several weeks,
and shaking them down for corruption, and
And then there was the case. Was it I think it was possibly the Lebanese foreign minister that he kidnapped?
The Lebanese prime minister.
He held him for a week or something.
Forced him to resign on television, and then before he let him go.
The war in Yemen. There's been a series of miscalculations on his part. This very brazen behavior that doesn't sit well with a lot of people in the region, and it doesn't sit well with a lot of people in Saudi Arabia itself.
Well, don't forget, of course, there was that action regarding the Canadian tweet, in which the foreign minister here in Canada tweeted a simple thing saying, you shouldn't violate human rights and arrest these Canadian citizens or Canadian citizen.
No. This was women. These were women activists who are related to Canadians. So.
I don't think he's even Canadian, is he?
His wife is Canadian.
And children are now living in Canada and have become Canadians. That's Rauf Badawi.
Rauf Badawi, who is in prison.
And it's his sister, right?
It's his sister who was arrested.
And the objection was because our foreign minister, Chrystia Freeland, called for the immediate release, which was a little bit too direct, I think, for the Saudis?
Yeah.
Well, there was a huge, I mean, basically what they're saying was the Saudis completely overreacted to this. I mean, first of all, there was a criticism that she shouldn't be tweeting diplomatic stuff like this in the first place, but the Saudi reaction was rather over the top. So, and it kind of indicated, as Professor Tepper said, it indicated what you said, is he tends to be very brash and reacts very quickly to certain situations. So anyway, this is a very tragic situation, and we're going to be finding out more, I suppose, in the days and weeks ahead, and we'll see what comes of that. So far, international reaction subdued because we don't have actual evidence, even though circumstantial evidence seems pretty clear. So that's yet to come. We'll find out more. Well, of course, another thing that's made international headlines is something that occurred right here in Canada when we became the first industrialized nation to legalize the recreational use of cannabis. And the media has been full of related news. Some of that has involved actual warnings, and rightly so. And Lynn, you looked into one of these in particular.
Yeah, I did, Mark, and that is the increased risk of developing psychosis for people who use a lot of cannabis. Psychosis is a family of psychiatric disorders that produce delusions, auditory hallucinations, and very bizarre thinking. I guess the one that people are most likely to have heard about is schizophrenia. That's also the most devastating of the psychoses. There's no proof that heavy use of cannabis causes psychosis, but there are studies that clearly show high consumption is linked to an increased risk of developing it. And this is particularly true for those who are starting use young. For details, I reached Ian Gold. He's an associate professor of philosophy and psychiatry at McGill University.
We've known for many years that cannabis use raises the risk of schizophrenia. And now that cannabis is legal, I think it's very important that people should be made more aware of that particular risk.
Well, can you explain that risk to me in a bit more detail?
There is an association between cannabis use and psychosis, which just means that people who use cannabis are known to be more likely to develop schizophrenia. That doesn't mean, or other forms of psychosis, of course, that doesn't mean that we're absolutely certain that cannabis use causes schizophrenia or other psychoses, but it's quite likely that it contributes to causing those illnesses. So what that means is, if you use cannabis, then your risk is increased of developing psychosis. Some of those varieties of psychoses might be immediate, but you also increase your risk of developing psychosis some years in the future.
Are there particular people who would be more at risk?
Well, there are other risk factors. There's a recent paper, in fact, surveyed nearly 100 risk factors and what are called biomarkers, which is to say signs of psychotic illness. So there are many things that can increase your risk. For example, if you have a family history of psychosis, then you are at a higher risk yourself. We know, surprisingly, living in a big city raises your risk. Being an immigrant raises your risk. Having had certain kinds of difficult experiences as a child raises your risk. We don't know a great deal about how cannabis use interacts with these other risks. In other words, if you're using cannabis and you're living in a city, is your risk extremely high, or is it only as high as the cannabis use or the city living itself? So there are lots of questions that research needs to answer.
Well, now that it's legalized, is there likely to be more research?
I very much hope so. I think since we've known that cannabis use is a risk for psychosis for many years, I think the only reason there hasn't been as much research as we need is simply because use has been illegal. So I'm hoping very much that now that cannabis use is legal, that research will be easier to do. And indeed, I very much hope that the government puts more money into research, because if the government is now behind the idea that cannabis use is relatively safe, or at least safe enough for most people to consider, then we ought to put our money where our mouth is and make sure that that's true.
Is age an issue?
Age is absolutely an issue. The earlier you use cannabis, the more dangerous it is. So we know, for example, that kids who start using cannabis at 15 are at greater risk of later psychosis than kids who start using it at 18. Again, we need to know much more about exactly how age interacts with cannabis use, but there's no question that more vulnerable people are younger.
Now, Professor Gold says policymakers must look at effective ways to warn young people about the risks of consuming cannabis. Of course, as we know, all of this is in the context of young Canadians having one of the highest rates of use in the world. An organization looked at cannabis use among 15-year-olds in 40 different countries, and it found that use by Canadians was the second highest at 13%. And in the same year, the Canadian government's own statistics agency reported that 20% of people between the ages of 15 and 19 in Canada had consumed cannabis in the past year.
Who was the first country, by the way? Do you know off the top of your head?
Don't remember. No.
Uruguay was the first country.
To legalize it.
To legalize.
Not to legalize, but to use it.
To use it to that extent, I don't know.
Use, yeah.
I don't know.
I recall a comment, and just briefly in passing, I saw this, and I thought it was kind of funny, but I think it was an American official who said that Canada has now become the largest legal drug dealer in the world.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of concern in the UN drug agency, slammed Canada, saying that it's undermining international drug
conventions
too. So it's not, there is no unanimous support for this.
No, that was back in June of this year when they were getting close to announce that the UN said.
And just on Wednesday, they repeated their position.
Well, we'll have more on cannabis coming up after this. All right, we're back again, and we have a few people watching us we'd like to say hi to.
Yes, we have Harold Heitman watching us from Newark, Delaware in the United States. We have Krzysztof Sajewicz from Poland who's just been watching us. And we had Sebastian Vasquez Mendoza. He didn't say where he's watching us from.
Well, we're just as happy to have him.
And of course, you can reach us, of course, by sending us a note. And if you have a particular question that we may be able to answer now or perhaps in a future show, drop us a line there. This on Facebook, right?
Live on Facebook, we'll be able to answer to you, or either live or later on if we don't have the answer, at the tip of our fingers.
We'll try to muddle through in one way or the other. So you were at the lineup, because the lineups on this first day, you were there for the first day here in Montreal, and the lineups were unbelievable for people who were eager to buy marijuana on the first day. I saw some news reports saying people had been lining up because as of midnight, the law became legal. So there were a number of stores that were open at midnight, notably in Newfoundland, which is the first time zone where the new day begins. And people had been lining up for hours and hours and hours in the lineup overnight to be the first to get. I find it interesting. They were big lineups, Levin.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, I grew up in Soviet Union, so I'm used to lineups, but this was really something else. I went to check out the store that's opened right in downtown Montreal. If people who know Montreal, St. Catherine Street, corner of Metcalfe and St. Catherine, it's really the core of Montreal downtown. And literally the lineup stretched for 3 city blocks. I'm not kidding. People were there from the wee hours of the morning just for the chance to be there. I don't know. I guess I spoke to a lot of people, and one of the sentiments that they gave me is that, this is part of history. We want to be able to say to our children that we were there when Prohibition fell. So I spoke to a lot of people, and one of the people I spoke to was Michael. Now, he didn't want me to use his last name because he travels for work in the United States quite often, and he said he doesn't want to have any problems with U.S. border guards. And then I find out that he's from Ottawa. And so he has driven nearly 200 kilometers from Ottawa to Montreal to be able to line up and wait for more hours just to buy cannabis. And he told me he's a habitual cannabis user, and I asked him, Why? And here's his response.
Why? Why not, man? It's an historic day.
Why is it historic?
Because a series of unjust laws are now gone. I'm going to be able to say that I was a part of this, that I was here, that I took part on the day that Prohibition fell.
Are you like a habitual user?
I'm a reasonably regular user, yeah.
Okay. Do you plan to change your habits?
No. No, this is probably not going to impact my life a whole lot. I think it's going to be good for the country, but personally, I'm not going to see much difference.
Explain to me, why do you think it's going to be good for the country?
I mean, first, just morally, we're no longer going to be criminalizing people that aren't doing anything really wrong, right? I think it's going to be good for revenue. There's going to be a lot of tax coming into the government from this. I think it's going to be good for our justice system. We're not going to be bogged down, trying people that just wanted to smoke a joint. I think lots of things.
A lot of people are concerned that this is sending a wrong message to the youth.
A lot of people confuse legal with good and illegal with wrong, right? Just legalizing something is not an endorsement. It's just admitting that people are adults and able to make their own decisions.
The government said today that they're going to table at some point in the future legislation to basically offer pardons to people.
They damn well better.
Why?
Because otherwise it would be massively hypocritical, right? Leaving people in prison, leaving people with criminal records, and trying people for something that is no longer illegal is kind of crazy.
Yeah, you can feel, hear the atmosphere. I mean, there were hundreds of people there, and TV camera. United States, Europe, all of the Canadian journalists were there. It was really something. I mean, there was a feel, you could hear and feel the buzz, no pun intended. And actually, I mean, there was so much smoke, you could actually get high just standing there.
Oh, they were smoking?
Oh, yeah, there were people, because people, I guess people were waiting in line, were smoking. And then some people who got into the store and bought their first legal weed or cannabis, just popped up those packages to show everybody. I guess everybody was curious what it looks like, and just lit up their cigarettes and joints, and the smell was overwhelming, especially if you're not used to.
It's pervasive, isn't it?
It's now becoming a pervasive smell. I mean, it's legal. It's very strange how in parts of Montreal it's absolutely legal to smoke it on the streets as long as you're within certain boundaries, and in other parts of the city, other boroughs, you cannot smoke anywhere on public property.
Well, that is interesting. When he was talking about, the pardons, it's not exactly a pardon. I forget the legal term for this, but...
Well, the thing is that the government wants to issue pardons for simple possession. So if you were charged only with simple possession, then you can, and if you've served your sentence, you can apply for a pardon. The left of center New Democratic Party is pushing the government to go a step further and actually to expunge the criminal records.
Yeah.
The Liberal government is not willing to go that far. They're saying that the expungement is reserved for really cases where constitutional rights of people were affected. For example, they're saying, as was in the case of gay Canadians who were prosecuted in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, that this was something that really affected their fundamental human rights, and that's something that they were going to, table legislation to expunge the criminal records altogether.
And of course, this will, as the fellow mentioned in the side, it'll clear up the courts. It will be less of a backlog for simple cases like this that take up court time and money and everything else. But I was thinking about this historic aspect of this, I was the first to buy pot kind of thing. Does anybody remember who was the first when alcohol became legal? I mean, when Prohibition ended in legal? I mean, Prohibition ended for alcohol. Would you be telling your kids, "Oh yeah, I had the first drink after"?
You'd be surprised. I asked a lot of people told me in this lineup that they're actually going to laminate their receipts and keep them as mementos, just to show that they were there. I mean,
Further proof that Canadians need to get a life.
They don't call it dope for nothing. Eh? Well, there's another aspect to this whole thing. Marie-Claude, you're on this case.
Yes, there's a very cute story about a little girl named Elaine Childs, who's 9-year-old, and on the day that there were those lineups in all the big cities of Canada for buying pot, she decided to go sell cookies to the people who often get munchies when they smoke dope. So we're talking about these cookies.
Girl Guide cookies.
Exactly.
Girl Guide cookies.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
See?
I haven't seen them since my
These are
kids were-
fundraisers for people who don't know. Girl Guides. Chocolate mint. I don't like chocolate mint.
Well,
you
I
didn't
think
bring maple?
maybe
I
in
like the maple ones.
Maybe in a few years they'll have cannabis cookies for the Girl Scout.
Go ahead, try it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Now, I know we haven't been smoking, but these are still pretty good tasting.
I'll try some.
You don't want one, eh?
No.
Anyways, supposedly this was actually the idea of her dad.
Come on in,
Because-
Chantal. Have a cookie. Come on.
Yeah, and she
She ended up selling 30 boxes in less than 45 minutes and earned $120.
for
So that's much less effort than walking around the neighborhood and going from door to
knocking
door.
on doors.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because usually they take these door to door and they knock on the door. Would you like to buy a Girl
So
Guide?
what are
Yeah.
they raising money for?
Well, these are
Say
for
on the
things like
box?
they're things like sending the girls to summer camps and things. You know.
Oh, I thought it was for a particular
because it's
charity.
free to get in the girls.
Girl
Well,
Guides, yeah.
Were you in them?
Okay, it says find out how your support makes a difference, and you can
never gonna go.
girlguides.ca/thanks-cookies.
You want me to
there
go
you
look?
go. Yeah.
Girl
First, I'm
Guides.
going to play a little. I'm going to show little
Okay.
images of her.
All right, let's see this.
That's a really cute little girl there.
Yeah, it's not moving a lot. So here she is, and soon because we talked about her also in the French show. So yeah, here we
You
go.
see her with her uniform on.
Yeah,
She got a lot of badges.
yeah. She's
Yeah,
good.
you earn those badges.
So here she
by-
has a little truck there.
That's a
With
wagon.
all
yeah.
her,
A wagon,
little
yeah.
wagon with her dad, and those are the lines, and
She came prepared.
yeah.
What a great opportunity!
Well,
You know, especially
the dad
if, as you
said,
say,
the dad says that it's a good way to talk about cannabis with the child and demystify it. And she saw that the people in line were of all age, all walks of life, and they had a very open discussion about it.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't
What do you
know.
mean you don't know?
Well, I mean, we talk about. I guess it's good to talk to your children
the
about
temptation.
this, just to make
They're
sure that they
peanut-free, by the
understand.
way.
But I think the jury is still out to for me. On the question is, are we exposing our kids to too much of
Yeah,
this? And
but
would
if they-
really a child at 9 years old know anything about cannabis? If
Oh, listen, she knows
and
about
does she
making money now.
If they don't hear it from you, they'll hear it everywhere
at
else.
9 years old?
Why
Oh, yeah.
not?
Oh, yeah.
Supposedly, also there were news of a child coming to school with a few grams of. We discussed that too, also in the other
Which
show.
is
I don't know the whole.
You have to be 18, and in
Or
some
19.
provinces, 19, depends on the province, of course. Anyway, very interesting.
Well, it's interesting that you said that fellow came from Ottawa, which is in Ontario.
Yeah.
Because even though it's legal across the country, Ontario hasn't actually opened
Yes.
any stores yet.
Yeah, you can order online, but you cannot go to a brick and mortar store and buy your cannabis in Ontario. So you had to drive all.
As for alcohol, can you transport cannabis from one province to another?
Good question.
That's a very good question.
Yeah, because we have stories about that too. So I also have images here of the first store that opened and the first buyers of.
And that's in St. Land.
Yeah, that's it.
And that
So-
fellow on the left is the owner of one of the major cannabis companies, which I believe it's Canopy or something it's called.
Yeah, and they were complaining that they ran out of stock really fast.
Yeah, and that's why some experts say that there will always be black market because, well, as long as there's the
Lack of supply.
the offer doesn't match the
demand.
The
Well,
demand.
listen, there's only
you know?
three. For example, in Montreal, there's only 3 stores.
Wow.
Yesterday, they had 30,000 online transactions, and over 20,000 people walked into the store.
Look at a map of Canada now. You can see a fog, smoke above it.
And on that foggy note, we're almost out of time for today as we enjoy our Girl Guide cookies. And so for Lynn and Levon and Marie-Claude and Chantal and Pierre in the back there, I'm Mark Montgomery. You see what happens? Take care until next week. Bye-bye.
We haven't had any cannabis. We should say that.
It's the cookies.
It's the cookies.